Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. Today we're talking about fear of commitment within the LGBTQIA plus community. We all know the stereotype, queer people can't commit, right? And if we talk about statistics, there is a stat out there about lesbian marriages being the marriages that last the least often out of any marriages. In reality, when put next to each other, there is not a lower likelihood for queer relationships to last when compared to straight relationships. But the fear of commitment that exists within the LGBTQI plus community does exist differently than fear of commitment exists for straight people. And we're going to talk about why. Fear number one is loss of sexual freedom and FOMO. And this might sound like a fear that anybody who is straight might have too. And they might, but it's for different reasons. When people grow up assuming that they're straight, assuming that they are going to be in a heterosexual relationship for the rest of their lives, and dating as such, maybe even marrying as such, when they are able to fully actualize who they are, the idea of committing to a relationship after that, the idea of being essentially tied down and not able to explore things with freedom, that can be scary. That FOMO isn't just about wanting to see what else is out there. It's about wanting to make up for some lost time. It's about wanting to self-actualize and give themselves the affirmation and the freedom that they weren't given that their straight counterparts inherently have. Now, yes, clearly we live in a society where it's not like sex is glorified, really. Like, we say that sex is glorified, and I guess it kind of is, but it's always like with caveat. It's always with a shaming edge. You know, there's always like a little bit of a pull back. Don't be too whatever. Don't be so much this. Don't be so much that. That exists for everybody. But when you grow up assuming you are one way and you either realize you aren't and you have to hide it, or you don't realize it for a long time. Once you figure out who you are, the idea of someone putting parameters on that can be really scary. That fear of commitment is going to show up differently for anybody who identifies under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella versus anyone who is cishet. Fear number two is this relationship going to work out? That is directly connected to lack of role models. It is difficult for people to see what a mature and long-lasting relationship can look like, or even a committed relationship could look like when you've never seen it. We talk about this all the time with people who have an issue committing to their partners or have a hard time understanding whether or not a marriage can work because they've never seen a marriage work. They didn't have parents who exemplified a healthy relationship. Well, they still saw straight relationships everywhere they looked. Like, they still saw other examples of relationships. And the examples that you see of relationships are going to mold how you understand relationships to be or intend to be. So if you never see any other relationship that looks like the relationship you're about to commit to, that's going to make it feel internally like there's something wrong with the relationship you're committing to. That's going to play into that fear, plain and simple. So not seeing anyone have a relationship that looks like yours, period, let alone a successful one, is going to make that more difficult. That leads directly into the next fear, which is internalized homophobia and shame. When somebody self-actualizes, understands who they are, decides what they're going to do about that, starts to live into that fully, there is a fair amount of shame and guilt that does get to be shed because they come into their own, and that's a great thing. However, that internalized homophobia, those like more buried, honestly, more sinister pieces that have been cultivated through most of your life, living in a heteronormative, heterosexist society, those pieces you're not typically aware of until you're faced with them. So then you're faced with them, and what do? A lot of times it's going to make you feel like there's something wrong with the relationship. If you are feeling like there's something off because you don't know your role in the relationship or you don't know your partner's role in the relationship, when in reality, you're trying to figure out, what do gender roles mean for me now, or how does that apply when we're both the same gender presentation? Like, how do we do that in this relationship, and how do we divvy things up? That gets really complicated and really confusing, and that can very easily be turned into, there's something wrong with this relationship, I can't be in it, or I can't be in any relationship because every relationship feels wrong. Well, it's very possible that every relationship feels wrong, not because there's something wrong with you, not because there's something wrong with you, but because internally there are pieces of you that has accepted things that society has told you are true about you when they're not. They're just not true. But there is a little bit of, no, there's a lot of internal work that needs to happen for you to get there. The next one is rejection of future family. This is something that is coming up more right now. I would say probably in the last year, it's more forefront, and it comes up this time of year more often because the end of the year does tend to be more frequent family outings, family gatherings, family visits. That fear of, if I get into a relationship with this person, if I get serious with this person, does their family accept this? Am I being asked to be somebody I'm not? And do we have to present ourselves in a certain way in order to be acceptable to both of our families? How does that work? All of those questions can prematurely end a relationship because that baggage for both or either or any of the people involved in those conversations makes the pressure on the relationship too much. If you know that you have family that is not going to accept a relationship that you have, period, and you've chosen to stay in a relationship with your family, you know that any relationship you're going to get into, you are asking that person to either not be in relationship to your family or to hide your relationship. You also know that that person might not want to do that, which might make you back off from having relationships in general. Is that a choice you've made? Yeah. Does that feel good? No. Family and external relationships play a huge role when you live in a heteronormative, heterosexist society. Codependency and loss of self. Okay, we need to talk about codependency. This is something that I forget not everybody understands, so let's do this. Codependency and co-reliance looks different in a queer relationship than it does in a straight relationship. Here's what that looks like. Many, I wouldn't even go so far as to say most, but definitely many straight relationships, the partners are not each other's best friends. They're not going to do things together. If there's like a girls' night or a boys' night, they're not going to do it together with their friends, right? Like that's not something that they're doing. That is something they're doing separate. When you are in a queer relationship, you are doing more things together. You are in a lot of ways each other's best friend and partner. There are things that you are doing together that if it was a heterosexual relationship would be read as codependent. That isn't when you're talking about a queer relationship. Now, when it goes into an unhealthy place, like
I cannot do things without my partner.
There's a difference between preferring not to and not being able to, right? Like, to be 100% honest, I don't like going places without my wife. Nothing is as fun without her as it is with her. But I can do it. I just prefer not to if I don't have to. That's the difference, right? If you cannot do things without that person, that is codependent no matter what kind of a relationship you're in. That is an over-reliance on the other person. And that is something that so many people caution against. And so many people are afraid of, that getting anywhere near that, feeling any kind of reliance on another person makes people back off so fast from any kind of commitment. And these conversations happen very frequently in queer spaces. Also, the number of people within the LGBTQI plus community who also struggle with substance use is high. When you're talking about someone who is in active addiction, when you're talking about someone who is in recovery, or you're talking about someone who is sober and trying to stay sober, their understanding and interaction with codependency, with over-reliance on a partner, is going to look different than someone who has not dealt with addiction. Those are different things too. Social stigmas. Any kind of non-traditional relationship, and I would put polyamory, any kind of ethical non-monogamy in here too. Not that that automatically goes under the umbrella of the LGBTQIA plus community, but anything that is considered non-traditional in the way of relationships is going to carry some sort of a social stigma. How do I explain this to people? How do I interact with the world in general? How do I explain who this person is, who these people are, who are with me? Do I need to? What's the obligation here? Like, all of those questions come up when you decide to make a commitment to somebody and be in a relationship with them. That in and of itself, having to explain yourself in general, can be enough to make someone back off of commitment, because the fear of rejection, of too many questions, of having to explain things that you shouldn't have to explain, of the invasiveness of the questions. Listen, I've talked about this before on the channel, and I'm just going to do this again for those of you who have not been around for long enough to have heard me say this. There is this weird thing that straight people do. It's like there's this entitlement that comes up when they hear that you're not straight, when they hear that you're not cisgender, and they have questions that they ask that they do not seem to understand are inappropriate. They would never ask a cishet person these questions. They would never ask them in this way or at all. And yet they feel like they have the right to ask them. I have had interactions with people who have told me that I'm being secretive or whatever because I didn't come out and explain to them the nature of my relationship with my wife. I just introduced her by her name because that's her name. When the same person had introduced her husband by his name. It's so weird. It's so bizarre that the assumption is you have to explain yourself, but no one else does. Like, knowing that you're going to go into social situations and that's going to be expected of you is for some people enough to not want to commit, because that pressure and that expectation is a lot. Another one is late blooming or developmental lag. This is something we've talked about a lot on this channel. When you are coming out what you would consider later on in your life. And that means different things to different people. So I'm not going to put a timestamp on that. But when you are coming out at a time that you consider to be later in your life, there are things that you may feel like you missed out on. So similar to that first fear, committing to someone means that you are not able to sort of engage in multiple different ways in dating and in those experiences. But it also means that there's a potential power dynamic issue when you get into a relationship with someone who has been able to live openly as they are for longer. There's a potential information, maybe knowledge difference in that. And that can be very intimidating. That can be really scary. And that can be something that can be taken advantage of if the person is the type of person to take advantage of other people. That's a very understandable fear. And that is something that could make people be afraid to commit if they understand themselves to have or expect that they're going to have some sort of a knowledge deficit. So that there, a very understandable reason why people might back off from commitment. Another one is lack of defined gender roles. This honestly comes up maybe more than most people would think, especially in the beginning of relationships. If you have understood your place in a relationship to be one way, and whether that's defined by a gender role or not, that's defined by a role of some sort. If you understand your place to be one way in a relationship and you are starting to get close to someone who doesn't complement that necessarily and doesn't sort of like fill in those spaces, and you have to like renegotiate those roles, you don't necessarily fall directly into a societal expectation of how you would work in that relationship. It does sometimes get interpreted as this relationship is just not going to work, when in reality, it just needs to be talked about. Like, it just needs to be a conversation of how do we both show up as ourselves in this relationship if it's going to go further, and be able to also complement each other and also support each other. Those are hard conversations to have if you don't know how to have them, if you're not equipped to sit down and have vulnerable conversations with people. That vulnerability can be scary also. I get it, but that is a fear that can keep people away from having relationships. And the last one is minority stress and mental load burnout. This one I would say is especially prevalent right now and has been getting more prevalent recently. The minority stress is any stressor that is felt by anybody who possesses any sort of minority status of any kind. The stress that you feel of that, of not being the ones in charge of the room, of having to be aware of places that you're not safe, of having to be aware of the way that a federal or state administration approaches who you are and what that means for them. The stress of having to be aware of those things on a regular basis and the burnout that comes from that, those are exhausting. Being in a relationship that puts you front and center in that fight can be too much to ask of somebody. That can be too much to ask of yourself. So that can be something that is just not on the table for people right now. Also an understandable thing. Okay, so why are we talking about these fears? These fears are all very understandable, and sometimes they're just excuses. If you want to be in a relationship with someone, Here's the thing. You get to write the rules of your relationship. You get to write them. The rules that exist out there are crap. They're not even the rules that the majority of straight people are following because you don't know what's happening in people's homes once you're not around them. You just don't. So you do get to set the rules in your relationship, and as long as they are agreed upon by the people in your relationship, that's how it works. You do not have to be under these umbrellas of heteronormity, cisnormity. You don't have to be under these normalization umbrellas. You can just be you and be partnered with somebody, begin a relationship with somebody, decide whether or not it goes any further, be partnered with more than one somebody. You can make this work how you need to make it work, and it can be okay as long as everyone is aware of what's happening. Do I need to say that part? These fears, while very real, do not have to stop you. Being aware of them and being aware of how to self-actualize alongside of being afraid is how you get past them if you want to get past them. And if you don't want to, that's your right too. Being realistic about the fact that these fears are stopping you is also an important growth point. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other.